Okay, I'll use Sophie.
Excellent. I shall just share the paper. Getting it up here. Can everyone see the paper?
Yep.
Excellent. Well, hello and welcome to this week's NPlan Paper Club. As Peter has just introduced me, my name's Sophie, and today I'll be talking through NVIDIA's paper entitled RankRAG, Unifying Context Ranking with Retrieval-Augmented Generation in LLMs. Actually, what I was just going to do quickly here is for those who haven't already had access to the paper but would like to read it, I'm actually just going to share it in the chat here. Here we are. And if you're watching async, I think this will be pasted in the description, so feel free to access it. This paper was uploaded to arXiv on July 2nd of this year, and it's another preprint. My previous one was a preprint. Clearly, I've got the thing for the preprints and the latest things coming out. As a refresher, this means that the article has yet to be approved for publication and may be subject to reviewers' comments to decide whether it's fit for publication. The authors of this paper are based at NVIDIA and Georgia Tech. The first author is UAU, who authored this preprint during their internship, which is pretty exciting. And the submitting author was Wei Ping, who's the principal research scientist at NVIDIA. I checked on the NVIDIA website for its research papers, and this isn't actually published yet. My assumption that is because that's a preprint. So if you're looking for it there, it won't be there. Excellent. So where did I find this paper? I actually found this paper when I was actively looking for papers on RAG, so like kind of via a Google search. I was doing this particularly because I was looking at kind of exploring the advantages between RAG and fine tuning, like when to trust particular things. You know, like when will models actually react to what it's taken from RAG versus what's in its memory? I find that really interesting. And this paper came up as I was doing that research. One of the main reasons I found this quite interesting is because it looks at RAG and fine tuning together in the same model, which this is the first time I'd come across that. I don't think it's particularly rare, but it's the first time I'd come across it. So I wanted to have a look at this paper and share it with you guys today. Just a bit of housekeeping before I dive in completely. I wanted to cover how I'd like to structure today's paper club, which is largely in two sections. First bit is kind of an overview to get us all familiar with the paper and its contents, while the second is a bit of a deep dive into the paper and its technical kind of solutions and kind of how a little bit more of a detail about how it goes about achieving what it does. So first, as part of the high-level overview, I'm looking at the paper from a really practical viewpoint, you know, really just making sure that we are all on the same page about kind of like what problem is the paper trying to solve? How hard is it to solve? And does it actually succeed in what it's aiming to do? And also a little bit of how the authors are trying to approach this problem, again, from a high level. And in the second bit, I'll try and dive into a bit more of the core concepts that come up. In particular, the concepts that I'd like to look at today are about two-stage fine-tuning and unified fine-tuning, because this paper uses both. So I thought that is something that's quite fun. So what is the high-level problem that this paper is trying to address? Well, this paper tries to address some of the limitations that are apparent with current like retrieval-augmented generation pipelines for LLMs. In particular, it's got like it looks at the struggles that are apparent with context handling. That is that LLMs that have too many chunk contexts that, you know, return from the RAG really have like an issue in being able to identify which are the most important things to use in returning the generated answer. So right from the start, I'm going to take you to a very fun little figure that they have here. And this kind of shows you, I hope that's, yeah. Let me know if you need me to zoom in, guys. But this kind of shows an example, like compared to some existing open source models about how that are actually designed to particularly work well with RAG, how increasing number of like context chunks doesn't actually always improve performance. In fact, you know, as a kind of, you know, they only have 5, 10, and 20 here, but often around 10 context size. Does quite well for on different baseline data sets. So that's kind of the problem that it's kind of looking to like deal with initially. So while, you don't want to pass too many contexts to an LLM, because, given this, even with a large context window, a lot of context can kind of just give too much noise and kind of lose what's important. We still want to make sure there's a high recall, and so that the models still get all of the information from the base database that it wants to get. So this really kind of introduces a precision recall kind of problem. And this paper looks at trying to make sure that there's a mechanism to ensure high recall of the relevant content with only a small number of contexts passed to the LLM. And so that is the key focus of this paper. Why is it important? Well, let's just take a step back and kind of look at like what RAG is in general. I am sure we're all familiar with it, but it's kind of always good to have a bit of a refresher. So RAG is particularly useful when used with LLMs to make sure when dealing with data which might be kind of like a long tail knowledge, so not as popular, not as frequently occurring in the training database of a model, or a little bit more esoteric, a bit more niche. And also for out-of-date info. So, you don't want to necessarily be training your LLMs, too often. It's really good to be able to have a base data set or a non-parametric data set, which you can use to access to be able to check that information. So by improving recall, it means that you can have a larger portion of this relevant information that's coming from this long-tailed knowledge or even out-of-date info or just information, which is very important, and that can lead to more complete and accurate responses. With this enhanced accuracy, we have reduced information gaps, we have more comprehensive answers, improved multi-hop reasoning. It's also more efficient use because you're not using as much detail. If we're limiting how much data is actually passed to the LLM to generate the answer, or included in like the context. It reduces the overhead, it reduces the cost. So ultimately, we can kind of end up with higher trust in the LLMs and better decision making from via this process, which is really handy. Why is this hard to solve? One of the key reasons this is quite hard to solve is balancing that precision recall problem that we kind of talked about before. I mentioned this in particular because there are a number of different ways that different papers look at trying to resolve this problem, but also that there's like a fundamental kind of issue when it comes to retrieving information, retrieving context information, which is that the context isn't always easy to identify, like just fundamentally, because context, like the context can be difficult because why can the context be difficult? Identifying the main reasons that the context is relevant to the actual answer might be very nuanced. It might not be very obvious in how it actually relates to the question. It could be part of, again, it could be like implicitly implied. And so this is something that can be quite difficult, especially because it goes beyond keyword matching. It really does require an understanding of the semantic nuances. And it can also rely on kind of previous interactions, especially when it comes to kind of conversational like data sets. So this is one of the reasons it's really quite hard to answer this. And this is, and one of the reasons I wanted to particularly address this, even though I find it quite hard to articulate, is because this particular complexity is something that this approach really does try to kind of attack head on, is this idea that, actually knowing like how to rank what context chunks are important is difficult and is nuanced. So that's something that this paper definitely dives into. As I mentioned before, there are actually various different techniques to deal with some of these particular problems. For example, balancing the precision and recall. This is done in various other papers. It splits up often many papers will split up the retriever part of the RAG cycle from the rank step. So, you can bring back a lot of context with that retriever and then rank them and only take what's relevant through to the next stage. Some of the methods that are mentioned in this, that's just this chat QA15, which by the way comes up a lot. It does this, kind of, oh no, so that doesn't do that. But what that does is it actually looks at improving how the model itself can use the contexts, trying to train the model so that it can actually use like a large number of contexts to return without a ranking step. So actually trying to train a model to actually be able to just look at the context and know from without any ranking how to improve it. So that's a second option. And another thing that this paper does try to tackle as well is the fact that most retrievers used for RAG aren't actually very good. Not that they're not very good, but that they often use, maybe they're dual encoders or something like this. Maybe they use TDF-IDF to find similarity, and that these methods just kind of aren't state of the art. And so lots of RAGs implementations may fall down just because the retrievers that they're using aren't as strong. So what this paper does try and do, and other papers have done before it, is actually use a stronger retriever to make sure that right from the start, more relevant information is kind of coming through. So there are so for a number of these problems that this paper is addressing, there are actually quite a number of existing methods to try and tackle them. But what this paper does, which is quite different, is actually look at combining the fine-tuning framework. So what's novel is that it includes a unified ranking and answer generation within the LLM, which can really access some of that more nuanced responses for understanding which context is going to be the most relevant to the answers that come through. So let me take a little bit of a step back. So the authors propose a novel instruction fine-tuning network that unifies context ranking and answer generation within a single LLM. This approach is designed to enhance the LLM's ability to both select relevant contexts and generate accurate answers, improving the overall performance of the RAG system. This means that the model is simultaneously trained to identify relevant contexts and apply them to formatting answers. It also, so yeah, that's the novel approach that this uses. But as I mentioned before, it does actually use a cross-attention mechanism for the retriever. So it's able to actually make sure that when it's, as part of this framework, when it's actually retrieving the initial documents that are kind of fed into the model, that it is using kind of state-of-the-art retrievers, which consider both the query and the document together rather than considering them like independently, as a lot of other things do. And it also, as I've mentioned, that other studies do, it splits up the retriever and the ranking step. So, you know, the retriever will go and retrieve, it will retrieve like 100 different responses. It will then have a ranking step that then ranks these and then says, okay, I'm going to take the top 5. And that's how we deal with that initial problem that we kind of mentioned. It's taking the top 5 responses, and then it's then passing these to the LLM as part of that, the context that's able to return the answer, able to generate a response. So again, to go through how this whole framework kind of looks at first, let's see if we can, so this is the limitations, RankRAG. Let's go to this lovely diagram here. So the first stage of this process is to fine tune a model. Now, this is actually a 2-stage instruction tuning process. I will go into what this is a little bit later, but at the moment, I just would like to kind of cover this with like a high-level kind of overview. So the first stage primes the model for, the first stage of fine-tuning this model primes it for understanding the impact of context on final answers, and also improving its ability to respond to instructions. So it this fine-tuning process exposes the model to conversational data sets, long-form QA data sets, LM-generated instructions, and lots of train of thoughts data sets, to really mean that already, before we've even started fine-tuning it for a particular use case, it is much better than the base open source model. This does use open source models to actually return, to be fine-tuned and kind of follow the instructions that come through. These models are trained with instruction tuning, so this is a really useful stage to be able to have in it. So the second stage that it uses is to fine-tune on ranking and generation data. So all of the responses or all of the inputs to this across all of the different data sets that it is trained on this stage are split up into the kind of the instruction and the question, the instruction which is within the question, the a context and an answer, and it's able to train the so the same model that was just fine-tuned before, train it particularly simultaneously on being able to identify what is a good answer, like what is the kind of a gold standard of generating an answer, and also what are the best context chunks, like what are the gold standard context chunks that are relevant to generating the particular answers. What is also quite fun about this is that it also uses a third step, or like a third kind of type of data, where it trains the model to have seen 5 different contexts and actually pick which of those contexts are relevant to the answer as well. And in some cases, none of them will be. So this is really trying to train the model to be really aware of kind of like what, to really learn what is relevant to the retrieval process and what contexts are good contexts to be used. So once the model is trained, at inference time, a retriever is used to fetch, say, 100 contents chunks. And in this study, they do use 100. And then the fine-tuned model is used to identify the top K results. In the actual response, like in the actual study, I think they use between 5 and 10, and you look at these and compare the results. And then this way, they're able to make sure that only relevant context chunks are used. And then they then use the same model to generate the actual answer. So it's kind of like if you're studying for an exam, you're the person who's going to be answering the responses, and you've also been trained to kind of identify what's going to be useful for you to be able to answer the responses. So I think that that's a really interesting way that they've looked about it. The authors do say that the authors do look at like using different kinds of retrievers and things with this, and you can see that it does hamper performance. So that's kind of one thing to be aware of. And the authors also acknowledge that the extra ranking step does actually add a bit of time to how long this takes to at inference time, because you also have this extra step that's used. But really, the results show that this isn't like a huge amount of time, and so it's actually quite useful. So going on to the next bit. At a high level, what do the results suggest about the significance of the proposed method? Let me go and have a look at the results just to show you this here. So we have the experiments here. Excellent. Now, what I will say about this paper is that there are a lot of results. It is actually, there's a lot of results and there's a lot of information to get through. But the main takeaway from this paper is that against 9 different benchmarks, the RankRAG framework achieves comparable results with other state-of-the-art open source models. I won't go as far as to say that they're state-of-the-art yet. I would like to see the paper if the paper is accepted for publication. But it does really seem to hold its own against the other actual NVIDIA model here, ChatQA15, which is the model that I mentioned beforehand, which has been trained especially to process the context of like return from RAG, but without ranking. So, you know, it does perform very competitively. It does show that it compares kind of on par with some ChatGPT and some ChatGPT Turbo. If you look at these results, you can see that actually the Llama RankRAG actually outperforms them on some of these benchmarks. But what I find really interesting is that it has Claude 2 in here, and it doesn't have any more recent Claude models, which I think is very telling. Well, not very telling, but I would really be interested to see how this actually performed against other Claude models, which do tend to perform quite well on these kind of tasks. Another claim that the authors make, and is actually in the abstract to this, is that this method of RankRAG performs really well on specialized, is it appellation study? Here we are. Performs really well on domain-specific RAG benchmarks. And for this, it actually looks at the biomedical field and looks at a particular set of benchmarks that are kind of encoded in this medCPT. Here we are. These are the data sets that are within these, and the benchmarks come from this study. And how they actually perform in this domain. What I found really interesting about this is that they look at how RankRAG performs in the biomedical field, and they say that it attains almost exactly the same performance as ChatGPT-4. I am a little bit dubious about this, because if you look at the results, it actually only performs particularly well competitively on 1 or 2 of the 5 data sets from this biomedical baseline. And so I think that this is, being very generous. I think it would have been really interesting if the paper had delved into why did it perform better on some data sets rather than others, rather than saying, look, it's got kind of comparable results and kind of leaving it there. I kind of get the impression that the paper was very excited about doing a lot of studies and writing them up, rather than kind of like going into any detail about why things performed, or why they got the results that they did. And I think this might be something that reviewers will come back and potentially criticize the paper on. But it is worth, so even though I've criticized this bit a lot, I actually think it is very impressive that RankRAG, without being specially trained on any biometric data, did actually return competitive results across some biometric benchmarks relating to the biomedical field. So I think that that's quite exciting. How could the proposed approach in this paper be used in practice? I think this approach could be used in practice. I think it'd be quite possible to train yourself, especially because it's using open source LLMs. I think using open source LLMs is fantastic because you don't have the cost that's associated with proprietary models. That said, training with this data set did take 30, well, let's see where it is. It's in this purple section here. Excellent. So yeah, training RankRAG took at least 32 A100 GPUs, 10 hours. And if you wanted to scale it up to a larger model, a larger RankRAG, it took 128 NVIDIA A100 GPUs, 16 hours. So that's a significant amount of time to actually time and resources to do oneself. However, they might make these models available publicly, in which case they've already been trained and you can kind of use them going forward from there. Unfortunately, I was not able to find any of the paper's code released publicly, though there are lots of appendices that they're very keen that you can go through if you want to delve into kind of the results that they have, but again, there's no code available. So that kind of brings together the first part where we kind of looked at like what RankRAG, apologies guys, RankRAG is. And now I'd like to go into a bit more detail about some of the other areas of the paper. Before I do that, I think it would be nice to kind of have a quick reflection on the paper. I kind of already alluded to this a bit, which is that I think the start of the paper is quite well set up. It's very clear. It's very clear like how it's like what the experiment is, what the benchmarks are, and what the metrics it's using are. But I do feel that kind of when it gets to past this experiments bit, there are a lot of experiments, some which aren't even referenced earlier up in the paper. So for example, we have the main experiment, which is looking at how RankRAG compares to different benchmarks. But then we also have the other one I mentioned beforehand, which is how it performs on domain-specific benchmarks. But then it also has a number of ablation studies. So it actually looks at, if we take away parts of this training process, how does it affect the model? If we train on a different llama, how does that affect the model? It also has a look to seeing how data efficient RankRAG is. It also has a case study, which is quite interesting. It has time efficiency studies. So really there's a lot to decode once you get onto the experimental part of this. And for those that are interested, I think there's a lot of information in there that could be quite useful. The other thing I found about this part of the paper is that it did require a lot of detailed knowledge of a lot of the references it was making. It makes references to a lot of papers without delving into much detail about what the models in those papers are. So it kind of, I ended up, using Perplexity a fair amount to make sure I could have understood what the paper was trying to say. And the same with the data sets and things that are used here. As I've mentioned before, I'm kind of new to LLMs. So for me, this was, quite an intense kind of like barrier to entry for really reading up on what was happening in here. For those that are very comfortable with the various benchmarks, this might, just be quite easy. But given there's so many different experiments at the end, the ones I'm going to be focusing on today are really going to be that the ones I mentioned kind of earlier, which are the main experiment, how it performs against the 9 benchmarks, and also this domain-specific RAG benchmarks that I've already mentioned. I might also touch on how it performs with the different retrievers, and if we have time, I might also have a look at the case study, just because that is quite interesting and really does give an example of like how this particular method performed better than another open source method. And sometimes that kind of framework can really help to demonstrate how it's going. Sweet. So with that introduction, I will dive into the more researchy side of the paper review today. So the first thing that we often look at NPLAN when we look at trying to get into more of the academic side of a paper is how is the problem the paper is looking to deal with expressed mathematically. And in this paper, it is not explicitly, it doesn't have an explicit mathematical formulation of the problem. One reason that we often look at this at NPLAN is because there seems to be, or so I have been told, a preference in academic publications for papers that are able to express their problem this way. So that's one of the reasons we mention it, and that is missing from this. If we go to the problem setup, which I think is up here, there is kind of the beginning. Oh, so here's the problem setup. It's 3.1. Here we are. If we go to the problem setup, it does kind of begin to give, this mathematical notation. I found this problem setup personally it kind of missed the punchline for me. It kind of gave a bit of the information about how RAG works in general, and then kind of didn't. For me personally, I was kind of like, okay, so that's how RAG works. The problem setup seems to be a bit bigger than just RAG exists. So I think that's another thing I would note about this paper. But it did give quite a nice kind of summary of this is RAG and this is kind of the notation of how it works. I think they could have gone a bit step further and included a bit more of the mathematical notation here to show about what they were trying to solve in this particular paper. From there, I think it's quite fun to look at the key concepts that are behind the proposed solution to the problem. So as I mentioned before, I would say that there are 2 key concepts that I'd like to dive into. One is the concept of the 2-stage fine-tuning. This 2-stage approach addresses some of the limitations of the traditional fine-tuning, such as catastrophic forgetting and over-specialization, while still allowing for effective task-specific optimization. It's particularly useful in scenarios where maintaining general capabilities alongside task-specific performance is crucial. One of the things that it can really do by having this 2-stage fine-tuning is that you can really focus on just getting your model ready for general instruction following and learning that format, and also exposing your model to kind of a wider, more context and more information. So again, rather than diving down into particular domains, it's really allowing your model to understand, to be primed for what you're going to ask it to do, and also to begin to expose it to understanding how different contexts can relate to each other. So that's kind of one of the benefits of this kind of 2-stage fine-tuning process. The second stage is where you are able to fine-tune your model to concentrate on task-specific knowledge or semantic learning, which in this case is where it starts looking at the identifying how to rank the context and also how to generate a response. So by separating this, the model is less likely to over-specialize on a single task format, which can be a really big problem when we look at fine-tuning. The second concept I'd like to look at was the idea of unified fine-tuning, which is kind of the opposite of what the first thing was doing. So this is when one model is fine-tuned to perform multiple tasks at once. So this requires a unified architecture. So only one thing needs to be maintained. It means that you're not maintaining lots of different models for lots of different tasks. And actually you're able to, the model is able to learn from how it is responding to the question answering pairs of one type of problem. It can use that information to also use it to answer the other tasks that it is looking at. This in itself is kind of similar to quite old techniques, that's often used you can see it as a key to a lot of the success of large language models. I think it started back with like T5 back in 2019, where you have that transfer learning, where the same model is given a number of different tasks to learn from, where it is instructed at the task, instructed at the start of the input how it should respond. And so this is a like kind of a well-known method, and it's being applied here to really make sure it can try and use that unified training to be able to really access and be able to identify that nuance and that ability to understand when a context is going to be important for a actual response that is lacking from those other kind of from most of the other approaches to RAG these days. One thing that is important when it comes to this kind of unified architecture is to make sure that there's a standard kind of input-output standardization. So all of the tasks, you know, kind of look the same and have that instruction as a level to identify the difference, but within the same standard. And you can see that this paper does take care to explicitly talk about how it achieves this when it talks about the unifying RAG and ranking with instruction tuning. So that's really handy. The authors themselves do draw attention to the benefits of this approach, saying that even though it is quite simple, it empowers the LLM with the ranking capability by adding relatively a small amount of ranking data, and by standardizing these tasks into a unified format, they can mutually enhance each other, which I thought was a really neat way of describing what they're doing. Yeah, excellent. So given that we have been able to cover both of two key concepts, let's dive into the detail of how the RankRAG framework works. Now we have, so I'm going to go back to the picture up here. Oh, by the way, here is a nice table that shows you how the question, context, and answers are formed, which is very handy. So this is for all the different data sets, how that is formed. Excellent. So let's go back to this image that we had up earlier. To revise how this framework works, first, fine-tune a model with a two-stage instruction tuning process. Then at inference time, use a retriever to fetch the M results where M is bigger than K. So in this, they use about 100. Then use the two-stage fine-tuned model to rank and fetch the top 5 results. And then use this to fine-tune the model. In this section, I wanted to go into a little bit more about the data that was used for the fine-tuning and how it really impacts how the model learns. So if we look at the first stage of the, oh, that's not it, here we are. First stage of the supervised fine-tuning, you can see that it uses 4 different types of data sets. So it uses conversational data sets, a long-form Q&A data set. I believe they use Explain Like I'm 5. They use fine-tuned language models, few-shot learners as a data set for chain of thought, and they also use LLM-generated instructions. By using these particular data sets that they use, they would improve the conversational abilities of the fine-tuned first stage fine-tuned model. They can improve their contextual awareness. This is particularly done through the long-form QA data sets. One quite fun thing that they do here is that they train the data with only computing loss for the last response of the answer is the last part of the conversation. So the model is able to kind of learn through that whole conversational backwards and forwards how that ends up getting towards that final answer. So it's able to kind of begin to get that contextual awareness. Again, it has explicit instruction following data sets in here. So it is able to respond to questions that need a clear or concise response, which is exactly what this paper is trying to do with the kind of ranking and with the ranking aspect. And it basically improves the ability of the model to perform zero-shot and few-shot generalizations. Given what I've read from this, I would definitely be tempted in the future, if I was going to do fine-tuning, to look at doing this as a first stage to what I was going to do as a follow-up stage, because I think it is really useful to just prime the model in this way. And again, especially in this case, we look at that kind of conversational aspect to get the ability for it to kind of be aware of the context it's trying to use. I think that there are ways that this could be used in other contexts to prime a model for downstream fine-tuning as well. So now that that's covered, I wanted to move on to the second stage, which is unified instruction tuning for ranking and generation. This uses 5 different data sets for training. This, by the way, it does have details in the paper about how long this training took for these 2 different stages. The second one does take a significantly longer amount of time. They do use different learning rates, and I think they use the same atom optimizer for both, but they do use different parameters for both and do train for a different amount of time. So that's really worth kind of checking out in the details if you would like to recreate it. But yes, so to return to the second stage, so this uses 5 different data sets, if I remember correctly. Yes. The first is that they train with the same data set they had from the start for the first fine-tuning. This is just to make sure it doesn't lose what it's learned. So we kind of keep that kind of information coming through. The second is it uses a context-rich QA data set. This basically helps fine-tune the model for generating the answers for a given context, or at least that's how I interpreted it, because it has a question as a golden correct context and an answer, and it really tries to get the model to make sure that kind of from the context it can really generate the answer that it wants to do. It has the Retrieval-Augmented QA dataset, which is, again, constructed of a question, a golden context, but also includes top retrieved context from the base dataset, which in this case, I believe they give the information on what the base dataset is in here. Implementation details, inference stage. Oh, forgive me, I seem to have lost what the base data set they're using this for. Anyway, I'll continue and hopefully be able to share that after the session today. But yeah, so they use the question, the golden context. Oh, there must be, yeah, okay. The golden context, along with other retrieved context. They use BM25, which is a popular ranking function to do this. And when they return this, some of these will not actually contain a context that is relevant to the answer. So this is where they begin to expose the model to being able to be a bit picky with how it actually pulls through the context. They have another, so we go through from context-rich data. Yeah, they have context ranking data, where it's the model is trained to choose whether with a true or false kind of Boolean answer about whether a particular context is important or not. And they also have retrieval-augmented ranking data, which is the final one down here, which they use to train the LLM with the capability to determine the relevance of multiple contexts simultaneously, given a question. So you can really see that they do really, this paper does really require you to understand the different data sets and to know how they interact with the model and a little bit more of a lot of detailed information about them. I've tried to give a little bit of information here about it, but I do think that is something that I definitely found was quite intense when reading the paper. I did feel like I was kind of looking to, Perplexity and Google a lot to try and make sure that I could get some of the context to make sure I understood the impact that these different data sets would have when trying to train the data. One thing that was particularly interesting was actually how they used an augmented, and this is part of this contents ranking data, they used an augmented conversational QA pairs. So this is when they made their own data set that was designed to also be a context ranking data. So this is a Boolean true or false input output that they train the model on, saying whether this context is relevant. And they created this actually out of the conversational QA pairs that we mentioned earlier. They did this by treating each conversation as one document, cutting the document into 150 chunks, and then each chunk was compared to the ground truth answer and then ranked by the n-grams. So if like how many n-grams that are in the ground truth appear in the chunk, and those with a recall of over 0.5 were marked as relevant or true. So that was also something I found quite fun in this paper, which was how you could actually augment existing data sets to provide fine-tuning data for what you end up using going forward. So as we've already seen, there's actually quite a lot of quite a lot of experiments and quite a lot of detail in what they use. So I've tried to make this as kind of high level as possible to kind of get the key ideas of what they use. So as I said, they have a lot of experiments. There's the comparison of the standard metric performance of how RankRAG does against 9 different baseline data sets. There's the ablation studies. There's the experiment on domain-specific rank benchmarks, and also the comparison to other RAG ranking measures. I'm going to focus now on the, as I said, on the kind of comparison to how it compares against other models on 9 baseline data sets. So yeah, let me start with that one. So here we go. Here's some information about how it's implemented. And let's have a look at table 3. Yes. Here we are. So here are the results, as we had a bit of a look at earlier on how it compares against the 9 different data sets. Key things to take away from here is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's only one Claude that's actually trained with 5-shot learning rather than few-shot. Most of these are trained with like 0-shot, but they did make some exceptions for some of these. They didn't give information on why they did that, and unfortunately, I don't know why they did. If anyone knows why they did, please let me know. But yeah, not all of these were 0-shot, but most of these were. And again, the main takeaways is that the Llama RankRAG with 8 billion performs really competitively against other models of the same size. And in fact, when it's actually scaled up, it compares against much bigger models. Yes, Peter.
My best guess for the number of shots is that they didn't want to redo the experiment, so they just take the results from another paper, and that paper probably did it with 5-shot. Yeah.
That will be exactly it. As you can see, they have like the results. They did get them from public reports, and so that would be, yeah. Thank you, Peter, for pointing that out. And that's why, again, like a lot of these are missing because public papers didn't have this information available publicly, or they couldn't find it. So that's why there's a lot of dashes kind of in here. There is a really big lean towards open source models, and again, I find that as someone who often uses proprietary models, I'm not always aware of all of these different models, so I can't necessarily know what these do. I think it would have been really interesting if even the paper had an appendix which had a little bit of information about these, because there are a lot of them and it does require quite a lot of like detailed knowledge to be a little bit more aware of what's going on here. I particularly wanted to look at the results which show that the RankRAG performed well for the PopQA datasets, and the I'm not sure if well is exactly how you can say that this went, but better than other open source models on this WikiQM QA dataset. I don't know a huge amount about these datasets. I had a quick read. The first of these, the NQ Trivia QA, Pop QA, they're part of an open domain like QA. So some of these would be written in public forums. Some of them are privately collected, which have that Q&A kind of facts. The paper here talks about how the let me find it. The Pop QA is a particularly long-tailed data set, and that the 2 WikiM QA tasks are multi-hop, and it suggests that, well, given the way that the RankRAG has been trained, it performs better on these more difficult data sets. I think that's really interesting. I would have quite enjoyed it if they went into a little bit more detail about that particular part. But that's the information that we have, is that, yes, it performs better on those 2 particular data sets because one is long-tailed, so having improved rank, bringing through more having a better recall on the context that you bring through would improve the long-tailed QA, as we kind of mentioned at the start. And again, with the multi-hop as well, that's quite useful. So those results are really quite promising. But as you can see, they actually on this perform significantly better than ChatGPT and ChatGPT 4. Do they? Yes, for the pop QA and these ones they do. So I think that's very promising results. We've also already discussed the performance of these on domain-specific benchmarks. Just for a little bit more information on these, it uses MED-CPT as a receiver. It uses the MEDCorp corpus as its corpus, and it uses the Mirage benchmark, which includes 7,663 questions from 5 commonly used QA datasets in biomedicine. The paper doesn't actually say which metrics were used, and I couldn't find information on that. And as I said beforehand, the paper was quite excited that it performed 90% as well as ChatGPT. But as you can see, when you look at these, it performed particularly well on PubMed QA and MED-MC QA. Well, it performed better than on these data sets, but it doesn't on then ChatGPT. But again, the paper doesn't really go into detail why. We can assume maybe it's similar because they maybe have like a long tail or a multi-hop, but it would have been really handy if they had gone into a bit more information on that. So, but that is still quite exciting. The other bits that they looked at quickly were so we've got the main experiment. They did also look at some ablation studies. So that is, well, okay, so what are the most important parts of RankRAG that really influence the outcome of this? So, they looked at training the model or training the fine-tuning without different parts of the different data sets within the fine-tuning training. So without the receiver QA or the here, where are these? Yes, without the Retrieval-Augmented QA and without the Retrieval-Augmented ranking. So without those two kind of parts of the fine-tuning. So they really wanted to see like how important were they. And they did find that they, interestingly, for some data sets, this did actually, or they actually improved the results. But overall, it was best just as kind of RankRAG, like, with all the components that they used. So that was, suggests that, yes, going forward, you should use all of these components, but maybe if we look into the details of these particular data sets, we could see why they actually performed, especially in the case of this hotpot QA, like a little bit worse by including this Retrieval-Augmented question answer data set. One thing I thought was quite interesting about this bit is that they also compared to Raft here. Raft is a paper that isn't written by Lin et al., which is why I find that a little bit interesting that they have that in here. Raft is a paper that also looks at augmenting fine-tuning data for domain-specific tasks from March 2024. So I thought that was quite interesting, or maybe that there was like just a misspelling in what they mean by Raft, because the name of a paper that's done by Lin et al. is slightly different. So I couldn't quite tell, what it was trying to achieve here. But basically it says this particular training isn't actually trained with that same sort of ability for the model to actually understand the relationship between the context and other contexts. So, they were handled individually, and therefore this would lead to the suboptimal results that are found using this Raft. But I'm not sure which Raft paper they're actually referring to there, whether it's the one by Lin et al. Or the one from the other one that was published by Microsoft in March. So that's kind of bringing us towards the end of what's going through with the results here. Again, they look at using different ranking modules. And as we can see, they RankRAG ranking outperformed other papers. So that's another reason that it would be really good to use this RankRAG rather than the standard kind of ranking models if you want to have that step within your RAG pipeline, that ranking step. They also look at the do some experiments to show that RankRAG is data efficient and that it is also relatively time efficient. So I won't go into them now as we're getting towards the end, but I would just like to finish off on looking at the case study that they present. There are more case studies available in the appendix, but I feel like this is actually a really good example of kind of why this RankRAG can do better than some other open source models, in particular ChatQA15. By the way, I'm not sure if I mentioned it earlier, but this is another model that has been developed by NVIDIA and is available on Hugging Face, and it's an open source model, and the weights are available. It was actually developed by one of the writers or one of the authors of this paper, so it is actually quite interesting that they refer to it a lot. It seems that this is a natural extension of that paper to some extent. But yeah, so they have a case study where they can compare how the different answers that are returned from this model that is used, again, they're using the same retriever for both of these. They use the Dragon Retriever for the ChatQA15 to see like what responses are returned and what answers that it gets. So what context does it choose to use between the two? And you can see that with RankRAG is that it was able to pull back a little bit more information that was able to help it choose the right answer. So the question was, who hosted and won the inaugural World Cup? The answer is Uruguay. ChatQA15 predicted that it would be Germany, as RankRAG was able to bring through some pertinent information from the context, again, without any specialized training, just from that ability to be able to combine like what, learning what is useful for generating the answer, like what is a useful way to rank the context. It was actually able to get this correct prediction. So in conclusion, I think that RankRAG is a interesting paper. Again, I think that it does add to the academic field, or at least my understanding of different ideas about how fine-tuning LLMs can be used in combination with RAG to actually improve the responses that we get, and could potentially be quite a significant step forward in how we actually improve how we trust LLMs by improving the accuracy of what responses we're actually getting through from them. It also improves efficiency. That said, I think it is quite important to make sure that if, this is very dependent on, making sure like the right receiver is used and things like that. So in the end, I would say I'd be interested to see whether this is published. And that is my conclusion. Are there any questions?
The thing I was, there's a question.
Oh, yes, Julian.
Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm still knee deep in RAG. I've made quite a bit of progress, but I've got lots of bits and pieces working. So my question is, and it's a practical question, as I tend to ask. There's no code with this, you said, unfortunately.
No.
Do you, or does anybody know of any code, for instance, within Llama Index, which I'm using a lot at the moment, or LangChain, or anything else that could help to implement this? Because it does sound absolutely fascinating, and definitely this ranking problem is starting to bite. And my issue is that I'm going to be using hundreds, if not thousands, of PDF books. So I'm going to make everything about as bad as it could possibly be, but it's not deliberate. That's the problem I'm stuck with. So anything that can help with re-ranking and ranking is going to be hugely helpful. And this idea of choosing, bringing in some fine tuning, all the things you've been talking about in this paper, I just wish there was some code. So my question is, where might I look for either some code or some analog of what they're doing to help me try to implement some of this stuff?
Unfortunately, I don't know off the top of my head. I can have a bit more of a look around. Again, I think particularly because I found this when I was looking, because I'm interested in exactly the question probably you're talking about, like with ranking. I didn't find it through channels that would normally have that kind of papers with code kind of aspect to it. I think if this is published, it is likely that it will be added to NVIDIA's website. And I think then it will be quite likely that it will be linked to some code. So I think maybe just keep an eye out on how that goes. This came out in July. I'm not sure what the usual kind of turnaround for this, but it still seems that it's like quite recent that it was added to archive. I actually think I always feel a little bit cruel when I go through these and critique these. I think it's a really good paper. I think it's very thorough. Mine were just kind of as a newcomer, some kind of suggestions to it. So hopefully it does get published and we can get access to the code.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Anyway, I will go through it, and I'll go through when your talk gets posted online, because it is extremely interesting. Because in the cases where I'm dealing with, it's not very much use to have got small examples working. Great, I can, parse over a Wikipedia article or 5 and get some quite good answers. The trouble is, when you're dealing with huge amounts of stuff, everything starts to fall apart. So all the things you're looking at here are very, very helpful.
Given that, I think it'd be really interesting to maybe look at the Dragon receiver. I was, thinking about maybe even retriever. Sorry, not sure I keep saying receiver. Retriever. I think looking at that could be particularly interesting.
Yeah.
I was almost going to look at that as the kind of the concept I was looking at, but I went with the fine tuning. But I think if you look up that paper, I think that that's a little bit older and has been used across a number of different papers, and that could be a really kind of good first step to get that code on how it just improves the retrieval process. Again, especially because it's not a dual encoder and it's a cross encoder, which might be quite useful.
Yeah. Have you actually built a RAG system yourself yet? Me?
No. I'm still learning. I think we do have them at MPlan, but yeah, not that I built myself.
Yeah, they're simple in theory. They're simple, but in practice, to get something that does anything more than the banal or trivial result is not simple.
It really does seem that way. And actually, I found some really interesting papers on the comparison between fine tuning and RAG, and I found that the RAG, yeah, and they kind of deal with some of these problems that RAG is great in theory, but how does it go in practice? And if you have any of these papers that you could share, I'd be really interested in having a look at those too.
Oh, are they in the paper, or can you send them?
They're not in the paper, but I can send them. Some of them that I found, the reasons I didn't choose them is because they're a little out of date. But I'll send them through anyway, because I think they're still quite interesting. When I say out of date, I mean kind of like, end of last year.
Yeah. No, that's still really good stuff. Will you send them via? I mean, which way do you want to send them?
I think I have your email. I can send it to you.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you, Peter. Yes, Milvius is on my list. Didn't get to it yesterday, but it's very high on my list. It's mentioned in, for instance, I'm using a lot of Llama Index, which looks like, Llama Index is very interesting. If you're going down the practical track, you might want to look at it. It has lots and lots of examples. They do, for my taste, they're rather open AI oriented. I mean, I use GPT all the time, but all my experiments are all open source.
Yeah,
really all open source. So it's very important for me. And so Llama Index leans a little bit proprietary, but they do say that you can use other things. I mean, for instance, Llama 3.2 came out yesterday, and I've just started using it a bit. I really want the vision models, but those aren't in Llama yet, and I've not managed to get them to work in anything else yet. But this is very exciting to have 3.2, and so yeah, it's and I've also, by the way, the other thing is, you spoke about it a little bit, but have you looked at much at embedding models?
Embedding models for retrievers, or
like Nomic, like BGE?
Oh, no.
Because that's really important. And the new BGE ones, they're all open, reckon that they outperform Nomic, which was pretty good in itself. You could, in the earlier days, like in ancient history, you would use Llama 3 could be used, or Llama 2 even, as an embedder. But now there are quite a lot of specific embedders in there, and they, as I'm sure you know, make a huge difference also. And some people get very excited and say, oh, you must only use OpenAI. They're the only ones. But I don't want to use OpenAI for APIs. I'd much sooner stick with Open. You see, with my volumes, OpenAI or Gemini's just come down in price in the last day. It doesn't really matter. When you're talking about 10,000 books, you're talking about an awful lot of money.
A lot of money. It's a bit crazy, yeah.
That was great. Thank you.
No problem. Peter, question or?
I think we'll end it here just because we're over time. But thank you, Sophie. That was a really good presentation. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks all. Catch you next time.
Thanks, Sophie.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.